Even if a rabbi desired to extract it, he could not. Not if he's an orthodox and observant rabbi who goes by rabbinical halakha. Because he's bound by what we call the word and the prayers of Chazal. Chazal means Chachamenu Zichronu Levracha, our wise men of blessed memory. And what Chazal has put in, we are of insufficient authority to remove. We must leave it in. And therefore, here it stays. But there's more. And I can show you thousands of places like this. But I'm here only to show you just a few. To prove to you that the name Yeshua is not foreign, but very intimately known. And by the way, why do we expressly say the name at the time of Rosh Hashanah? Because that's when we blow the shofar, and that's when the sound of the name is not likely to be heard by the nations, by the non-Jewish people who may very well be present. You know, there's an interesting story that I can tell at this point, that we tell of the time of the Spanish Inquisition. There was, at that time, a gentleman called Don Aguilar. Don Aguilar. And he was a famous Jewish composer of music, and as well as being a composer, he was a conductor. Don Aguilar was what we call a marrano. Marrano is the Spanish word for pig. And that was the word that they used about Jews who had externally, to save their lives or the lives of their families, converted to Christianity, and yet inwardly and secretly they maintained a full Jewish life, and they maintained it under threat of death, and a very painful death, a very horrendous death. Well, it came time after the Jews were expelled from Spain, that the Marranos, the Jews who had converted, remained behind, but always under suspicion. And of course, during the time of Rosh Hashanah, the commandment of the Torah is, you must hear the shofar blown. If you don't say a prayer, if you don't do another thing, you must gather yourselves together in a particular place where the shofar is sounded. That's the commandment. And then if you've done that, you have fulfilled the commandment of the Torah. Even if you've done nothing else. And the Jews had to do it, and they couldn't do it. Except Don Aguilar decided that he would solve the problem of the Jews. And here's how he did it. On that particular day, the day on which fell Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, the festival of the blowing of trumpets, called in the Torah, the Bible, he called a great concert, and he invited at that time Queen Isabella, King Ferdinand, that they should all come, and the whole royal court, and all the Christians, all the court of the church, the whole hierarchy of the church, that they should come as well. And that they should hear the concert, which was going to be music of all nations. And true enough, on that day, everyone in the kingdom came, including the Marrano Jews. As a matter of fact, the Marrano Jews were forced to come, because it was a great day. It was a day of rejoicing. It was a day of, after all, if any Jew was caught behind, they would suspect him of observing Rosh Hashanah. And so the Marrano Jews had to show up, because then they would prove to the Gentile world that they were no longer observing Jewish customs or laws of the Torah, God forbid, but that they had eschewed all the laws of the Torah, and that they were obeying only the Christian laws, which was at this particular time, come to the concert. And they came. And so did the Christians. And so did the royalty. And Don Aguilar began his concert of the music of all nations. And everyone was thrilled by it, as the various musicians stood up and played different compositions, all in a medley of a song from all the nations of the world. And finally there was one section in which the musicians stood up, and they had a very strange instrument in their hand, known by no one, an instrument which we know as the ram's horn, the shofar. They lifted up the shofar. And they blew Tkiya, Pa, Teruah, Pa, Teruah Shvarim, Pa, Shvarim Teruah, Pa, Teruah, Tkiya Gdoila, Pa. All the Jews in the hall knew what was happening. And every heart beat faster. Every ear and every eye watched for and listened for the Mashiach. They knew it, they felt it, they could see him coming, they could hear him coming. And not a single Christian knew what was happening. Not a single Christian realized that every Jew in that hall was calling upon the name of Yeshúa and not upon the name that they had accepted via the Christians under forced conversion. That they were listening to the sound of the shofar and that they were uplifting the name of Yeshúa, which had they been discovered, they would have met with a terrible death at the stake. And under Christian noses, Jewish tradition was upheld. But for this reason, we have had to keep it secret. This is our tradition, this is our history, forced upon us, albeit by the Roman exile and by the church, which had to come together with the Romans. After all, there was a political détente with the church. You couldn't have a history, you couldn't have a religion together with a government. The Roman government, the civil Roman government, could not join hands with the religious element unless they agreed. You can't have the religion preaching that the Jews are going back to their homeland when you have the political element saying we're going to take them out of their homeland. And so the religious element agreed, yes, we will obey all the laws of the politics, and we will say, okay, the Jews, forget about it, they're finished. And that's what is the hallmark of the Gentile book, which it calls the New Testament. There's no return in it of the Jewish people to their homeland. The message of the prophets is not carried forward. They say the message of the Messiah is carried forward, but it isn't. Because the message of the Messiah is the return. The ingathering of the exiles. It isn't a spiritual one, it's a very physical one. And together with that physical one are tremendously important spiritual overtones and undertones. But there's not a separation. The Messiah he's not cooking a barbecue in heaven someplace. He's coming back to this land to govern, to rule in what we call the kingdom of the Mashiach for 1,000 years. That's real. And he's doing it in his day. And this day, while I sit in Fortress Israel, I can now speak this without fear. That the Gentiles are going to murder me or my family, I don't have to hide. As Don Aguilar made it possible for the Moranos to hide. I don't have to hide anymore. I don't have to fear any longer. I'm home. And if you're Jewish and watching me, please, you don't have to fear either. You don't have to kowtow to your Christian neighbor who may become offended when he learns that you know Yeshua better than he does, because he never knew him in the first place. You can come home and truly see what I see, and I'm going to give you now the next thing, which is what we say on Yom Kippur, 10 days after Rosh Hashanah. After we have just said the name of Yeshua during the time of the blowing of the shofar, the ram's horn, we then come 10 days later to Yom Kippur, and on Yom Kippur we come to the high point of the service, which is called Musaf, the additional service. And at the Musaf of Yom Kippur, we have another aspect of the service called the Kedusha. And in the Kedusha, we interrupt that holy point, that high point of the service, to say what we call a piyut. A piyut is like a poem. It's really more than a poem, but I don't have a better word for it. And we read these words. Notice